Sibelius, the great bard of the Nordic regions and one of my personal favorite composers. His music is just full of this icy fire that is so reminiscent of the Northern European landscape and Northern European culture. Especially, Sibelius is quite inspired by this, the ancient Finnish national epic, really, as it's regarded, the Kalevala. It's a great new English translation in verse from Oxford World Classics, for anyone who's interested. Something else that's interesting, these Icelandic sagas, this formidable looking volume, but really a good entry point into the Northern European spirit. Actually, and it's something that's maybe a little more familiar to us, but very much influenced by these works. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, and other things. A lot of the northern spirit, as Tolkien himself calls it, was encapsulated there. But anyway, so the Sibelius Concerto very much influenced by this great Nordic tradition of literature and culture, and Sibelius brings that into musical expression in new and wonderful ways. So let's just have a look at the concerto. We'll go through a few salient points. Of course, we start with this wonderful atmospheric D minor chord with the whole string section in it. It's just this cold mist of sound, and then the violin suddenly emerges. Now, very often we hear the soloist kind of sneak in. I like to begin with a little more presence. He does write mezzo forte, and I think it's a really neat effect if out of this fog suddenly there's just this voice is just there on this non-chord tone. Crescendos us through this. And fades us out while the clarinet has the motive. And throughout the whole concerto, Sibelius is very intentional with his articulation marks. And this is actually a great example right here, the next phrase. So we have an accent, accent, no accent. So accent, no accent. So we still want it to be strong. But the variety of Sibelius's expression markings can really influence how we think of the phrase, how we think of where things are going, and how the elements relate to one another. I mean, just to see, you can see accent, no accent, but the crescendo is continuing to the next bar. So you have this with the hairpin in the middle. Things like that, but you might not notice those individual details when you hear a performance of the work, but they add up. And Sibelius's own notation invites us to have a very nuanced view of phrasing. And for the bigness and boldness of this work, I think it can really be enhanced if those little details are well attended to. All right. So on we go. First cadenza, pretty straightforward. Be creative. Be moody with it, a little bit spooky. Just fiery, wonderful writing, and that brooding orchestral tutti, and then we come back in. With this beautiful counter melody to the main idea in the winds. I remember one of my teachers, Rainer Kussmaul, late Berlin concertmaster, saying he likes to think of this as like an alto voice, and I think he even mentioned Marian Anderson by name. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous, rich voice. And the other tricky thing in this passage is the rhythm, because we have the winds have fours, and then the winds are still continuing in 3. So. And those these syncopations that we've got over here, remember they're just bouncing off the clarinets, who have the. So if we can just keep that in our ears when we're playing, I think it will glue together nicely. Very often this passage is just a little bit chaotic, and I think it can be easily avoided if we're just aware of what's going on in the orchestra. All right, and then. You round the bend and it's just mountains. It's such a glorious moment. So going into here, very often we have almost like a big fermata there, and I agree. When I play, I try to balance that tension against wanting to keep a correspondence in the ear with the motive as we've heard it up till now. So with some tension, but still with that musical eye forward to feel it like a pickup. Now in the orchestra, of course, we've got the. Pardon my very bad intonation in my wind section here. But moving in fours, and we're in threes over top. We want to feel that pull of 4 against 3, but at the same time, I don't think we need to be. It's helpful if we can be a bit free with it, and I think there's room for that. I think what I did this time, pulled a little bit more on the first one, and then waited on that third one just for a little bit more tension to propel us up. But there are so many possibilities, and I'll probably play it differently next time. But yeah, just really let that melody sing. Be free with it, where you feel the tension. Enjoy it. Move on when you have to. Okay, then into the propelling us into that fiery middle tutti and into the cadenza. So the what's wonderful about this cadenza is it's so integral to the shape of the movement, and it's like a dramatic monologue really, and it's refreshingly free from the cliches that we're starting to build up in cadenza the musical language of cadenzas around this point. So just enjoy that cadenza and. To put it in a very cheesy way, be the symphony, right? But you want to really make sure that this cadenza isn't just a showpiece for the violin, but that it's tapping into where the concerto has brought us to a very dark place. You have the basses and cellos, and then out of this we have this shriek from the violin. And so on, but and out of that anguish that the whole cadenza grows, and I think if we can keep that in mind, that will be a key to its success. All right, then the smoldering theme returns. So on, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. A lot of this is the same. Okay, let's jump right to the end. This octave passage at the end is it is terrifying aesthetically. I mean, it's awesome. These frantic sounding octaves, and it's awesome to hear. It can be terrifying to look at on the page when you're looking at it, especially for the first time. But don't be dismayed by it. I don't find it as bad as it looks. In fact, there are other octave passages that make me considerably more apprehensive than this one. I mean, for example, something like the third movement of the Brahms concerto, where you have and so forth. And I think the reason I find that harder, because each one is rearticulated, and it just has to be placed right there, including that nasty B to B octave. Sibelius, what's nice about Sibelius are these slurs. which means that there's a certain amount of glissando built into the passage, and that helps our ear just to kind of track where that octave is and nail it. So really not nearly so terrifying as it looks. The hard bit is that run up at the end where, and then from here it goes up in octaves and brings us to the conclusion. There are a few different ways to do that. A lot of times you hear it quite articulated. Sibelius does write these dashes underneath, which suggests to me that he wants them quite long. Whether there's any detachment, that might help to cut it through the texture. I think the last time I played it, and I don't know if I'd have to think about whether I would do this again. I kept it quite on the string, but good articulation, good beginnings of notes, because I just wanted to have this feeling of blazing to the top. And the reason being, if you look here, how do I position in front of the camera? All right, you have, where are we? We start that run. If you look at the orchestra, they have bom, beam, and then we have bom, beam, bom. So that whole theme of, then we have, and if we can hear that as a surging wave, bom, beam, bom, beam, bum, it can be a really just electrifying end, and I wanted to drive toward that top. So I kept it quite quick, almost just to have this effect of, and I think Isaac Stern goes for something a bit like that. There's a YouTube video of him playing the concerto. Not a young man at that point, but playing with an immense amount of vigor. And he does the octave at the end, 1-4, and at some point he switches to 1-3 and keeps it mostly on the string. And then I think he also switches down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, and ends on an up bow. So I don't do that fingering. That scares me to try to get it in tune with just a fixed fingering going up. So what I did when I wanted that same effect is I kept it fairly on the string, but to help my mind in that upper octave, I thought of 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1 instead of just thinking 1, 2, 1, 2 instead of groups of 1. And the reason I did that was just to kind of change things up a bit and give myself a goal in the middle that was not 1 and 3, just to kind of switch it up in my mind. And I found that kept the articulation strong, because otherwise this 2 and the 4, it was easier for them to get mushy. Another possibility is to feel 1 and 3 very strongly. And you can have an almost imperceptible release after every second one. That can also be another way of re-articulating it and just kind of helping the mind process that pattern. Because of course the difficulty is, in addition to just 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, some are minor seconds, some are major seconds, and then of course that little the minor second on top. So it is tricky, and one of those two approaches may help. Either just really emphasizing 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, or doing the complete opposite and de-emphasizing that in favor of having a goal of 2 and 4 somewhere in the middle. I actually had a teacher of mine who suggested a different fingering, which was just 1, 4, 2, so only every second note was an octave. And he said over an orchestra you can't tell the difference. And this same teacher also suggested the octave at the top and then actually fingering that high F instead of playing a harmonic. And at first, you think, well, Sibelius wrote the harmonic, but another consideration, though, is when Sibelius wrote the concerto, violinists were using plain gut strings. And a gut E string, it's actually hard. The higher you go, for example, like this top note, you can really get an extremely penetrating sound with the metal E string, which you can't on a gut string. It's not as brilliant naturally up there, but gut actually has much stronger and much louder harmonics. They're rounder, they're broader, they're louder. So between the top of your fingered octave here and the harmonic, there would actually have been much less difference. Very often in performances, it sounds like you arrive strongly at that D, and then the F is a little weaker. So a potential way of solving that could be to actually finger that high F. Just an option. All right. Second movement, so wonderful. Fairly straightforward. Apart from just, I would just say, save your bow and know exactly where you are in the bow and where you want to make things grow, so that you have all the resources that you need. One passage that often gets a bit chaotic is that double stop passage, and so forth. And the reason is just because that the 4-on-3 is really confusing. But it would be worth just taking the time to break it down, map it out if you need to, just look at all the subdivisions and try to coordinate it in your mind, because if that can really gel, it's thrilling. It's like you have these two rhythmic worlds going side by side and somehow corresponding. But if they can really feel distinctly 3 and distinctly 4, it can be thrilling. As you do that, you may need to resist the temptation to feel the ground, the most foundational rhythm being the 3s, for the fact that underneath you've got the bum 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 bum, bum the 16th notes in the orchestra, the 16th note patterns in the orchestra. And if you feel it according to 3, that doesn't line up with what they're doing. So you might actually need to feel, instead of do it the other way around. It takes some getting used to, but we practice scales, we practice arpeggios to try to get that technique down. And if we invest the same kind of practice in just trying to get our mind around this rhythm, it's the same sort of thing. Just practice it, get used to it. I think it's worth investing in that, because, like I say, this passage often sounds a bit chaotic, and I think that's a shame because it can be really thrilling when it lines up. As you saw, I changed. He slurs by groups here. When it's with an orchestra, I change bow in the middle just because we need as much sound as we can get. All right, I think that's. I mean, of course, the rest of the movement is so much going on musically, but I think fairly straightforward. Steaming forward into the third movement. So this third movement is one for me that very much benefits from having other Sibelius sounds in our ears, the sounds of Sibelius' other works, particularly the symphonies. Because if we don't, I think this movement can really run the risk of sounding like a gymnastics show for the violin. Okay, look at my dotted rhythm. Look at my arpeggios and thirds and up bow staccato and all of these things, and I think it's easy to miss the musical soundscape underneath that we can get a pretty good glimpse of by association with other works of Sibelius. So let's just look at a few things. We'll take it right from the top. So we start with this. And right, if ever there was a galloping motive, it's that, and then out of that, we have this. You can practically see a rider from the ancient Nordic legends, riding out of the mist to meet us today. And Sibelius writes poco forte, so very often we hear an aggressive, almost abrasive sound at that beginning. The orchestra's quite low. Of course, we want to project over the orchestra, but the orchestra is quite low in the register and marked pianissimo. I think we can afford to be poco forte and not over the top fortissimo. For two things. First of all, we want to leave room to grow. Second of all, we just want to make sure that it's not just a demonstration of bow virtuosity, that we really have a noble and heroic sound as much as we can. And then it's sequenced up a step. And we look at those harmonies. You have that E minor chord over the D. A very noble and heroic chord. And very often we can miss harmonic twists like that. And it just bum, bing, bum. Here we go again. But I think if we're really conscious of what those harmonies are, it can be heartwarming in a way that will really kindle our performance. So with that nice heroic chord. And oftentimes we end it there, and then. But again, if we're thinking of the symphonies, we might recall in the second symphony that phrase before it goes into the. And it's very much like that here. And then on it goes. So I like to feel. He writes a crescendo to that high note, and then I like to still feel the energy of the phrase going on, and then we move on from there, and so forth. So I think just keeping the phrasing associations and the sound associations in our ears can really be helpful. Another place where those sound associations are come in really handy, I mentioned briefly earlier, the up bow staccato thirds. And very often it sounds like that kind of gritty, stiff-arm staccato that we might expect from a slower or a staccato type stroke, a stiff arm. For me, what this passage really reminds me of is Sibelius' use of wind pairs, whether it's flutes, clarinets, horns, and especially falling on the beat over a D major chord. We have that 6th scale degree. It passes in a 16th note, but falling on the beat, we hear it. And I just think about how Sibelius is so fond of that. So I'm thinking of something like the 5th Symphony. That glorious swan call that you have in the horns. And if we think about, or really all through the 5th Symphony, it's almost you might call a harmonic motive of sort. But if we can feel these up bow staccatos as being like pairs of oboes or flutes, I think that's going to bring us a little bit closer to the sound world that Sibelius might have had if this were just a plain symphony and not a violin concerto. So to get that sound, I don't do a stiff arm. I don't have a very natural. I don't have a stiff arm anyway. I have to really practice up bow staccato for any of you who may be in a similar boat. But I like to feel each impulse from the wrist, and if you use a little bit more bow on each one, it can really get a nice woodwind-like effect. But for me, especially when you're trying to project over an orchestra, doing that, I run a little short of bow, so I do down bow and broaden it to the top. But I think in any case, if we're thinking in terms of woodwind sounds, that feeling of when woodwinds rearticulate, that kind of the breath carrying the articulation, I think that's probably a little bit more of what he has in mind, and just rising up to that high point before going on. I think that serves the purpose quite well. There's so many other wonderful and fun things in this movement, but I think I'll leave it at that and just enjoy as while preparing this concerto, or just living with this concerto throughout a lifetime, Sibelius's symphonic works and the other. It's amazing how many little parallels you can find in ways that, when I'm playing, I love to come to a point where I think, this reminds me of the Fifth Symphony or the Second Symphony, the First Symphony, and it's like it taps into that whole emotional world, and in that little moment you have this world opening up within a moment, and when things like that happen, that can really make a performance inspiring for the performer, and that's what's so necessary for it to be inspiring to the audience as well. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful, and as always, thanks for watching.